The demand letter slapped against my ranch gate in the Texas wind, while Diane Holloway stood beside her white SUV, telling me I owed her HOA 3 years of dues. Dust scraped across the cattle guard. My fence line shook behind her. She was trying to bill land that sat outside her subdivision, and the amount on that paper could affect every rancher along our private access road. I held the gate key, the recorded easement map, and the county parcel file tied to my ranch boundary. Then Diane tapped the letter with one polished nail and said liens were already being discussed. That was the moment she stepped onto ground she did not understand. The metal gate creaked between us. A pair of cattle moved slowly near the mesquite trees. The afternoon smelled like dry grass, dust, and sun-baked steel. Diane wore cream slacks, a gold bracelet, and the kind of smile people use when they believe the rules belong to them. She said my property had benefited from community services. She said all surrounding landowners were expected to contribute. She said refusing to pay would make me a problem for the entire neighborhood. I looked past her SUV toward the paved entrance of Willow Creek Estates, half a mile down the road. Their stone signs stood there behind trim shrubs and matching mailboxes. My ranch did not. My gravel road turned west before their first lot began. My fence had its own gate. My mailbox sat on county road frontage. My water well, my access road, my pasture, and my maintenance costs had never gone through her board. My name is Caleb Morgan. I am 45 years old, and before I bought this place, I worked as a land surveyor for nearly 20 years. Boundary lines are not feelings. They are not neighborhood rumors. They are measured, recorded, filed, and carried forward in legal descriptions that do not care how confident someone sounds at your gate. Diane did not like that answer. She lifted another page from her folder. It was an invoice. Then another. A violation notice. Then another. A warning about unpaid assessments. Each page looked official. Each page used bold letters and tight deadlines. The paper smelled fresh, like it had been printed that morning. She had not come for a conversation. She had come for submission. I asked her for one thing. Legal proof. Not a newsletter. Not a map drawn by the HOA. Not a board opinion. A recorded document showing my ranch had ever joined her association. Her smile held for a second too long. Then it changed. Behind her, a second vehicle pulled up near the gate. A man stepped out with a clipboard and started photographing my fence, my driveway, and the cattle guard. Diane said they were documenting noncompliance. The words sounded absurd out here under the wide Texas sky. Still, the camera clicked. Once, twice, 3 times. That sound bothered me more than the letter. Not because I was afraid of paperwork. Because paperwork is exactly where people like Diane make their biggest mistakes. I folded the invoice in half and slid it into my shirt pocket. She told me I had 10 days to pay. I told her the clock would not start until she proved authority over my land. The wind went quiet for half a breath. Even the cattle stopped moving. Diane turned back toward her SUV without another word. But the man with the clipboard kept taking pictures. That told me this was already bigger than dues. The sound of that camera stayed with me long after the SUV disappeared down the road. Gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked back toward the ranch house. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the pasture. A breeze pushed through the tall grass and rattled the metal windmill near the water tank. Everything looked exactly the way it had the day before. Yet something had changed. Diane had not come asking for money. She had come acting like authority already existed. That distinction mattered. I unlocked the front door and dropped the invoice onto my kitchen table. The paper landed beside a stack of feed receipts and equipment manuals. Dust floated through a beam of sunlight near the window. The ranch was quiet except for the distant sound of cattle moving near the western fence line. I unfolded the documents again. The numbers were absurd. 3 years of dues. Penalties. Administrative fees. Additional assessments. The total kept climbing with every page. Then I noticed something else. Not one document included a recorded property description. Not one referenced my parcel number. There was plenty of confidence. Very little proof. That detail stayed with me. I poured a cup of coffee and stepped onto the back porch. The smell of fresh dirt drifted across the property. A hawk circled overhead. Beyond the pasture, the rolling Texas landscape stretched for miles. No entrance monument. No HOA signage. No community gate. Just ranch land and county roads. That was exactly why I bought this place 2 years earlier. I wanted space. I wanted independence. Most importantly, I wanted clear boundaries. As a surveyor, I spent years watching people argue over assumptions. Fences moved. Stories changed. Memories failed. Recorded documents remained. That lesson paid for itself more than once. A pickup truck appeared near the eastern fence line. It belonged to my neighbor, Travis Bennett. He owned the ranch bordering mine to the south. Travis stepped out and walked toward the porch carrying a folded envelope. His expression immediately caught my attention. He tossed the envelope onto the table beside the invoice. Same logo, same letterhead, same demand. A dry laugh escaped him. He said Diane visited his place an hour earlier. Then he said something that stopped me cold. She claimed several other ranch owners had already agreed to pay. The statement felt polished, practiced, like it had been repeated throughout the afternoon. Travis shook his head and stared toward the pasture. Neither of us had ever attended an HOA meeting because neither of us lived inside one. Yet somehow we were now being treated like delinquent members. Another mini hook emerged right there. If Diane was visiting multiple ranches, this was not a misunderstanding. It was a campaign. The wind picked up and rattled the porch screen. Travis pointed toward the envelope. He said the amount on his notice was different from mine. Higher. We compared the paperwork side by side. Different totals. Different dates. Same threats. Same language. That bothered me more than the fees themselves. Before leaving, Travis told me one more thing. A third ranch owner had received a notice the previous month. Nobody mentioned it because they assumed it was a mistake. We stood there listening to the windmill turn slowly in the distance. The sky had started turning orange above the horizon. What began at my gate was spreading across far more land than I realized. The next morning, I decided to see exactly where Diane believed her borders ended. The next morning, gravel popped beneath my truck tires as I followed the county road toward Willow Creek Estates. The sun had barely cleared the horizon. Long shadows stretched across open pasture land. A thin layer of dust hung in the air behind me. I wanted to see the borders with my own eyes. Not because I doubted where they were, because I wanted to understand how Diane was selling a different story. The stone entrance sign appeared ahead. Fresh landscaping surrounded it. Sprinklers clicked softly beside trimmed hedges. Beyond the entrance sat rows of matching homes, identical mailboxes, and carefully maintained streets. Everything looked organized, controlled, deliberate. My ranch looked nothing like it. That difference mattered. I pulled onto the shoulder and stepped out. The morning air smelled like wet grass near the subdivision and dry earth beyond it. A survey marker stood several yards from the entrance road. I recognized the style immediately. County installed. Permanent. Another small detail worth remembering. A security vehicle rolled slowly toward me. The driver lowered his window and asked if he could help. I introduced myself and pointed toward the entrance. Then I asked a simple question. Where does the HOA property actually begin? The guard answered without hesitation. At the subdivision entrance. His finger traced an invisible line toward the homes. Then he pointed away from the neighborhood and toward the surrounding ranch land. Different ownership. Different responsibility. Different jurisdiction. The answer came too quickly to be rehearsed. That made it useful. As I drove away, another thought settled in. Diane was not targeting random properties. She seemed focused on ranches bordering the subdivision. That pattern kept repeating. 3 notices. 3 neighboring ranches, same pressure. Same language. Same assumptions. Around noon, I stopped at a local feed store near town. The bell above the door jingled as I walked inside. The smell of grain, leather, and motor oil filled the building. Ranchers gathered near the coffee station discussing rainfall and cattle prices. Ordinary conversations. Then I heard Diane's name. Not loudly. Just enough. One older rancher mentioned receiving a letter 6 months earlier. Another said he ignored it. A third said the letters eventually stopped. I listened without interrupting. More pieces started connecting. The campaign had not started with me. It had simply reached me. That realization widened the story again. A mini hook emerged from a casual conversation near a shelf of feed supplements. One rancher mentioned hearing that the HOA wanted additional revenue for future projects. Nobody knew if it was true. Nobody could confirm it. Still, the rumor lingered. Rumors often point toward something worth checking. I bought a bag of mineral blocks and headed back toward my property. The drive took nearly 40 minutes. Open land stretched in every direction. Fence posts passed in a steady rhythm. Wind pushed across the grasslands. By the time I reached my gate, another envelope waited inside the mailbox. My stomach tightened slightly. The paper carried the same logo, same return address, different contents. This time Diane was not requesting payment. She was requesting compliance. According to the notice, I needed approval for exterior structures visible from neighboring properties. I stared at the page while the wind rattled the mailbox door. My barn sat nearly a mile from her nearest member. My cattle crossed pasture land she did not own. Yet somehow she believed she could regulate both. The invoice had become something larger. The moment I unfolded the second page, I saw a name that changed everything. The name sat near the bottom of the notice in small print. I read it twice to make sure I was not imagining it. The compliance review had supposedly been conducted by a property standards committee. One member of that committee was listed as Travis Bennett. I stared at the page while the mailbox door banged softly. In the wind. That made no sense. Travis had been sitting on my porch the day before complaining about the exact same notices. I folded the paper and drove straight to his ranch. Dust followed my truck across the gravel road. The afternoon heat shimmered above the pasture land. A few cattle stood near a stock pond, barely moving. When I handed Travis the notice, his expression changed immediately. He took one look at the committee list and laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. He had never served on any committee. He had never attended an HOA meeting. He had never authorized his name to be used anywhere. The wind rattled a loose section of fence behind us. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Travis walked inside his barn office and returned with a folder. He dropped it onto the tailgate of his truck. Inside were 3 notices he had received over the previous months. Same logo, same threats, same references to committees and reviews. The signatures changed. The language barely did. We spread the papers across the metal tailgate. The steel felt hot beneath my hands. One detail immediately stood out. Different committee names appeared throughout the documents. Different reviewers, different approvals. Yet many of the same people supposedly served on all of them. Some names belonged to residents we knew. Others belonged to people neither of us recognized. A mini hook emerged from the paperwork itself. The more pages we compared, the less organized the system looked. Diane kept presenting the HOA as a polished authority. The documents suggested something very different. Travis called another ranch owner named Owen Carter. 20 minutes later, Owen arrived carrying his own stack of notices. The pattern widened again. His paperwork contained different fee amounts and different violation dates. Yet it referenced the same committees. One reviewer listed on Owen's notice had moved out of the county nearly a year earlier. We confirmed it within minutes. The discovery settled over the group like a storm cloud. Somebody was generating authority on paper faster than anyone could verify it. The smell of hay drifted from the barn. A tractor engine hummed somewhere in the distance. We spent nearly 2 hours comparing notices line by line. Every answer produced another question. Then Travis found something buried in the fine print. A reference number. Small. Easy to miss. The same reference number appeared on all 3 properties. Different owners. Different notices. Same number. That detail bothered me immediately. Administrative systems usually assign unique tracking references. This looked copied, reused, manufactured. The sun dropped lower toward the horizon. Orange light spread across the pasture. The stack of notices grew thicker as more ranch owners arrived. By sunset, 6 neighboring property owners stood around the tailgate reviewing paperwork. None belonged to the HOA. All had received demands. All had been told compliance was mandatory. The campaign was larger than any of us realized. Yet one fact remained unchanged. Nobody had seen a single document proving the HOA had authority beyond its own subdivision. That absence was becoming impossible to ignore. As the last light faded across the fields, Owen mentioned something he found at the county appraisal office the previous week. Everyone stopped talking. Then he reached into his truck and pulled out a folded map. The folded map crackled as Owen spread it across the tailgate under the fading Texas sky. Everyone leaned closer. The paper was old enough that the edges had started turning yellow. Dust collected in the creases. A battery lantern cast a pale circle of light across the surface. The smell of hay and dry grass drifted through the evening air. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Owen pointed to a boundary line running along the eastern edge of Willow Creek Estates. His finger followed the line north and south. The subdivision sat neatly inside it. Every HOA lot appeared exactly where it should. Then he moved his finger west, toward our ranches, toward my property, toward Travis and the others. Nothing connected us to the subdivision. Nothing. The silence grew heavier. A coyote called somewhere beyond the pasture. The sound carried across the darkening fields. Owen explained that he found the map while reviewing appraisal records after receiving his second notice. At the time, he thought it would help clarify a simple mistake. Instead, it raised bigger questions. The map showed tax parcels, recorded tracts, and development boundaries. More importantly, it showed where the HOA stopped. The line ended long before reaching any of our properties. Travis folded his arms and stared at the map. Another ranch owner shook his head slowly. We had all assumed someone else would challenge the notices eventually. Instead, each of us handled the situation alone. That isolation was beginning to disappear. A mini hook emerged right there around the tailgate. Once the ranch owners started sharing information, the story looked very different. The next morning, I drove to the county appraisal office myself. The building sat near the courthouse square in a brick structure that smelled faintly of paper, old carpet, and copier toner. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The clerk behind the counter recognized several of the parcel numbers immediately. That caught my attention. I asked for maps, property descriptions, boundary records, anything tied to the surrounding tracts. The clerk disappeared into a records room and returned with several folders. I carried them to a table near the window. Dust floated through the sunlight. Page after page confirmed the same thing. My ranch sat outside the subdivision. Travis sat outside. Owen sat outside. Every ranch receiving notices sat outside. The boundaries were not complicated. They were obvious. That made the notices harder to explain. Then another detail surfaced. Several parcels targeted by the HOA shared one characteristic. They bordered land visible from subdivision roads. The pattern jumped off the page. Diane was not targeting distant ranches hidden miles away. She was targeting properties people inside the neighborhood could see. That realization settled over me slowly. It suggested something more deliberate than confusion. Around noon, I stepped outside and called Travis. Gravel crunched beneath a delivery truck crossing the courthouse parking lot. The Texas heat pressed down from above. When I explained what I found, he was quiet for a few seconds. Then he mentioned something I had not considered. Visibility, property values, neighborhood appearance. Concepts Diane often talked about according to residents inside Willow Creek Estates. Another piece clicked into place. The issue might never have been membership. It might have been control. The possibility lingered in my mind during the drive home. Fence posts flashed past my window. Wind bent the tall grass. The open landscape felt larger than ever. By the time I reached my ranch, another envelope sat inside the mailbox. This one was thicker than the others. Much thicker. And the return address was different. The thicker envelope felt heavier than ordinary paper as I carried it from the mailbox to the porch. The return address belonged to a law office in the next county. That immediately changed the atmosphere. The wind pushed against the screen door. Somewhere beyond the barn, cattle moved through the pasture. I sat down at the wooden table and opened the package carefully. The smell of fresh ink drifted from the pages. The first document was a demand for payment. The second referenced ongoing violations. The third contained language about potential legal remedies if compliance was not achieved. It looked impressive. It was designed to look impressive. Yet within the first minute, something felt off. The parcel description section was blank. I flipped through the remaining pages. More warnings. More deadlines. More references to authority. Still no recorded document connecting my ranch to the HOA. The omission stood out like a missing fence post in an open field. A mini hook surfaced immediately. The pressure was increasing. The proof was not. I called Travis. 20 minutes later, his truck rolled into the driveway. Dust followed him across the ranch road. He stepped onto the porch carrying his own envelope. Same law office. Same format. Same threats. Different dollar amount. We spread both packages across the table and started comparing them. The differences were strange. Certain paragraphs were identical. Others referenced different dates and different committees. Yet the core claim remained unchanged. The HOA supposedly possessed authority over properties that county records placed outside subdivision boundaries. The contradiction sat there in black ink. Neither of us needed legal training to see it. Then Travis pointed at a page near the back. The attorney's letter referenced governing documents attached for review. We checked the package twice. Nothing was attached. The supposed supporting records simply were not there. We looked at each other. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The windmill turned slowly behind the house. A pickup passed on the county road. The ordinary sounds of ranch life continued while the paperwork became increasingly extraordinary. By late afternoon, Owen arrived carrying the same package. So did two other ranch owners. Soon the porch looked like an outdoor records office. Documents covered nearly every surface. Coffee cups sat beside survey maps. Property notices mixed with county records. The group kept growing. Every person had received pressure. Nobody had received proof. Another pattern emerged. Every legal letter cited authority. None included the actual source of that authority. That detail became impossible to ignore. The sun dropped lower. Shadows stretched across the pasture. One ranch owner, named Mark, mentioned something he discovered while speaking with a resident inside Willow Creek Estates. According to that resident, many homeowners believe the surrounding ranches already belong to the HOA. The statement landed heavily. Suddenly several things made sense. Diane might not only be convincing ranch owners. She might be convincing her own members. If true, the situation extended beyond fees and notices. It involved an entire narrative being repeated often enough to sound real. The possibility lingered over the porch as daylight faded. Then my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. The caller introduced herself as a homeowner inside Willow Creek Estates. Her voice sounded nervous. She said she had seen discussions spreading through the neighborhood. Then she said something none of us expected. She had copies of older HOA documents that looked very different from the ones being used now. Everyone around the table went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. She agreed to meet the following evening and bring everything she had. That call changed the direction of the entire dispute. For the first time, evidence might be coming from inside the subdivision itself. The following evening, the sky glowed orange above the pasture as trucks began pulling into my driveway. Dust rolled across the ranch road. The smell of fresh-cut hay drifted from a neighboring field. Travis arrived first. Owen followed 10 minutes later. By the time the sun touched the horizon, 6 ranch owners stood near the porch waiting for the woman from Willow Creek Estates. Nobody talked much. The previous week had changed the mood. We were no longer comparing notices. We were comparing patterns. A pair of headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. A silver sedan approached slowly and stopped beside the barn. A woman in her early 50s stepped out carrying 2 storage boxes. She introduced herself as Linda Parker. Her expression looked cautious. Not fearful, careful. She glanced toward the group and then toward the boxes in her hands. The cardboard edges were worn from years of storage. That immediately caught my attention. People do not keep old HOA paperwork unless they think it matters. We carried the boxes onto the porch. The wood creaked beneath our boots. Crickets had already started chirping beyond the pasture fence. Linda removed the lids and revealed years of newsletters, meeting packets, board summaries, and resident communications. The stack was enormous. Paper filled both boxes almost completely. The smell of old ink and aging paper drifted into the warm evening air. We started sorting documents across folding tables. The process moved slowly at first. Then something interesting appeared. An HOA newsletter from 7 years earlier included a subdivision map. Travis spotted it. He slid the page across the table toward me. I studied it carefully beneath the porch light. The map showed Willow Creek Estates exactly as county records described it. Nothing extended beyond subdivision boundaries. No ranches. No neighboring parcels. No reference to outside properties. Another mini hook emerged immediately. The HOA itself had once acknowledged limits. We kept digging. More newsletters appeared. More maps. More community updates. Year after year, the same boundaries remained visible. Then the documents suddenly changed. Around 4 years earlier, references to surrounding properties began appearing. The language seemed subtle at first. Community area. Extended neighborhood. Shared appearance standards. Neighboring land stewardship. None of those phrases created authority. Yet they planted an idea. Linda pointed to several additions she remembered receiving. According to her, residents gradually started talking about nearby ranches as if they were connected to the community. Nobody questioned it because the transition happened slowly. That observation stayed with me. Systems often expand one small assumption at a time. The wind rattled the porch screen. Pages shifted beneath paperweights and coffee mugs. Then Owen uncovered something even more important. A board meeting summary. The document mentioned a proposal involving surrounding properties visible from subdivision roads. The proposal discussed encouraging compliance and maintaining neighborhood presentation. Encouraging, not requiring. The distinction mattered. Several ranch owners leaned closer. The language was careful, deliberate, yet nowhere did it claim authority over outside parcels. We continued reviewing records for nearly 2 hours. The stars emerged overhead. Cattle moved quietly beyond the fence line. Then Linda opened the second box. Near the bottom sat a thick binder. Unlike everything else, the binder contained official governing materials distributed to homeowners years earlier. She handed it to me. The plastic cover cracked softly as I opened it. Inside sat formation records, policy summaries, architectural guidelines, and board procedures. I flipped through page after page beneath the porch light. The binder contained references to lots, residents, streets, and common areas. Nothing mentioned neighboring ranches. Nothing mentioned our parcels. Nothing suggested jurisdiction beyond subdivision boundaries. Then a folded insert slipped from between 2 pages and landed on the table. Everyone froze. The document carried a date from nearly a decade earlier. Across the top sat a title none of us had seen before. The room went quiet as I unfolded it. The folded document felt thinner than the binder pages surrounding it. Yet the moment I opened it, the entire porch went silent. The lantern light reflected off-aged paper. The edges had yellowed with time. A date from nearly 10 years earlier sat at the top. Below it was a heading identifying the document as a summary prepared during the original transition of board leadership. Nothing about it looked dramatic. No bold warnings. No legal threats. Just a routine administrative record preserved between larger files. Sometimes those are the most important records of all. I placed the document flat on the table. The night air carried the smell of dry grass and distant cattle. Crickets chirped beyond the fence line. Everyone leaned closer. Then I started reading. The summary discussed subdivision responsibilities, maintenance obligations, community assets, and future planning. Most of it sounded ordinary. Then one paragraph stopped me. The document specifically described the limits of the association's jurisdiction. Not implied, not suggested. Described. The language was direct. Authority applied only to recorded lots contained within the subdivision plat. Nothing beyond those boundaries fell under association governance. The words sat there in plain English. No complicated interpretation required. A long silence followed. Travis looked at Owen. Owen looked back at the document. Linda slowly shook her head. The statement contradicted everything Diane had been claiming. A mini hook emerged immediately. The document did not come from a county archive. It came from inside the HOA itself. That distinction mattered. Nobody could dismiss it as an outside opinion. The association had once acknowledged its own limits. We continued reading. Additional sections referenced neighboring ranch properties. The wording remained respectful. Cooperative relationships. Shared concerns. Good communication. Yet every reference treated the ranches as separate entities. Separate ownership. Separate authority. Separate responsibility. Not once did the document suggest membership. Not once did it mention assessments. Not once did it imply enforcement powers beyond subdivision boundaries. The evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The wind brushed across the porch. Papers shifted slightly beneath coffee mugs and flashlights. Then Linda remembered something else. She reached into one of the storage boxes and removed a stack of annual directories distributed to residents. The directories listed board members, committees, emergency contacts, and neighborhood resources. We flipped through several editions spanning almost a decade. The older versions consistently displayed subdivision maps. Those maps matched county records exactly. Then around 4 years ago, the maps disappeared. The directories became simpler, cleaner, less specific. Another pattern, another small change. None of it proved wrongdoing by itself. Yet every discovery pointed in the same direction. Boundaries were once clear. Then they gradually became less visible. Near midnight, most of the ranch owners headed home. The stars stretched across the Texas sky. The porch finally grew quiet. Linda stayed a little longer helping organize documents into stacks. Historical records, HOA publications, maps, meeting summaries, internal communications. The evidence now filled several boxes. Before leaving, she handed me a folder she had almost forgotten. The label on the tab immediately caught my eye. Board correspondence. The folder contained printed emails exchanged among board members years earlier. I promised to review them the next day. After everyone left, I carried the records inside the house. The kitchen table disappeared beneath paperwork. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. The ranch sat quiet outside the windows. I opened the correspondence folder and began reading. Most messages looked routine. Landscaping, budgets, maintenance. Then one email near the center of the stack made me stop. The sender discussed expanding influence beyond subdivision boundaries. Not legally, strategically. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. At the bottom of the page sat a familiar signature. The signature at the bottom of the email belonged to Diane Holloway. I leaned back in my chair and read the message again. The kitchen clock ticked steadily on the wall. Outside, the ranch had gone completely quiet. Only the occasional sound of wind brushing against the porch broke the silence. The email was not dramatic. That was what made it important. Diane was not discussing legal authority. She was discussing perception. The message focused on encouraging neighboring property owners to view themselves as part of the broader community. It talked about influence, appearance, expectations, cooperation. The language sounded harmless on the surface. Then one sentence changed everything. Diane wrote that formal authority was less important than creating consistent assumptions over time. I stared at those words beneath the warm glow of the kitchen light. The sentence lingered in my mind, not because it proved wrongdoing, because it revealed a strategy. A mini hook emerged immediately. The campaign might have started years before the first invoice ever reached my gate. I continued reading through the folder. Several emails referenced discussions about neighboring ranches. Most were routine. Some mentioned landscaping concerns visible from subdivision roads. Others discussed preserving a cohesive appearance. Yet none claimed actual authority. That detail remained remarkably consistent. The difference between influence and authority appeared over and over again. Around midnight, I found another message chain. This one involved several board members from years earlier. One director questioned whether the HOA should communicate with neighboring landowners at all. Another responded that cooperation was acceptable as long as boundaries remained clear. Boundaries. There was that word again. The older emails seemed obsessed with respecting them. The newer notices ignored them entirely. The contrast felt impossible to miss. The next morning, sunlight poured through the kitchen windows. Papers covered nearly every surface. Maps, correspondence, notices, meeting summaries. I called Travis and asked him to come by. Within an hour, several ranch owners gathered around the table reviewing the emails. The smell of coffee filled the room. Boots tracked dust across the floor. Nobody spoke much while reading. Then Owen pointed toward a date near the top of one message. For years earlier, the same period when HOA publications stopped displaying detailed boundary maps. The timing immediately caught everyone's attention. Another piece clicked into place. Around the same time, references to neighboring properties started appearing more frequently in newsletters and community communications. The pattern was no longer subtle. Something had shifted. We decided to organize the evidence chronologically. The process took most of the afternoon. Documents spread across the dining room table, the kitchen counter, and even the living room floor. By sunset, the progression became clear. Older records emphasized limits. Newer communications emphasized influence. Then came notices, then invoices, then demands. Every step built upon the previous one. None established actual authority. Yet together they created the appearance of authority. That realization settled heavily over the room. Around dusk, Linda called. Her voice sounded excited. She had remembered another source of information. During her years inside Willow Creek Estates, she saved annual homeowner packets distributed before major meetings. Most contained budgets and updates. One packet, however, included proposed revisions that never passed. She believed it was still stored in her garage. The possibility immediately grabbed everyone's attention. Failed proposals often reveal what organizations wanted but could not obtain. If the HOA once attempted to expand its authority formally, that record could explain everything. Linda promised to search for the packet that evening. The ranch owners slowly headed home as darkness settled across the pasture. The windmill turned steadily against the stars. I remained at the kitchen table reviewing notes. For the first time, the story felt less like a property dispute and more like a long-running effort to blur lines that had once been perfectly clear. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Linda appeared on the screen. She had found the packet. One page was highlighted. The highlighted page arrived in my inbox just before sunrise. I printed it immediately. The printer hummed in the quiet kitchen while pale morning lights spread across the pasture outside. A few cattle moved near the eastern fence line. The smell of coffee filled the room. By the time the first page slid into the tray, I already knew this document mattered. Linda would not have highlighted it otherwise. I placed the page beside the growing stack of records and started reading. The proposal came from nearly 5 years earlier. It was part of a larger homeowner packet distributed before an annual meeting inside Willow Creek Estates. Most of the packet covered budgets and maintenance plans. Then I reached the highlighted section. The proposal suggested exploring options for extending architectural influence beyond subdivision boundaries through voluntary agreements with neighboring landowners. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. The wording was careful, very careful. It did not claim authority. It acknowledged authority did not exist. That distinction changed everything. A mini hook appeared immediately. If the board had once proposed voluntary agreements, then someone understood formal authority stopped at the subdivision line. The proposal continued for several pages. It discussed appearance concerns, roadside visibility, and maintaining neighborhood standards. Nothing unusual there. Then I reached the final page. The proposal had failed. Homeowners voted against it. The result was recorded clearly. No expansion, no agreements, no authority beyond existing boundaries. The residents themselves rejected the idea years earlier. Yet somehow notices and invoices appeared anyway. I called Travis before breakfast. By mid-morning, several ranch owners gathered around my kitchen table again. Sunlight poured through the windows. The room looked more like a records office than a ranch house. Documents covered nearly every surface. Maps overlapped newsletters. Meeting summaries sat beside county filings. The highlighted proposal moved from hand to hand. Nobody spoke while reading it. They did not need to. The significance was obvious. Owen finally broke the silence. He pointed toward the rejected proposal and then toward the stack of violation notices. The timeline practically explained itself. First came the failed expansion effort. Then came years of gradual messaging. Then came invoices. Then enforcement letters. The progression felt impossible to ignore. Around noon, Linda arrived carrying additional materials. She looked tired but determined. Inside another folder, she found meeting notes from the same period. The notes discussed resident concerns about overreach and potential liability if the association attempted to govern land it did not own. Several homeowners had specifically warned against creating confusion about jurisdiction. The comments were preserved in writing. That discovery deepened the picture. This was not an issue nobody foresaw. People had raised concerns years earlier. The warnings simply faded into old files. Outside, the Texas heat settled over the ranch. Wind pushed through the tall grass. A screen door banged softly somewhere across the property. We spent the afternoon organizing evidence into a clear timeline. Every major document received a date. Every notice received a category. Every map received a source. The structure helped. Once arranged chronologically, the pattern became remarkably simple. Official records consistently respected boundaries. Informal communications gradually blurred them. Then enforcement efforts appeared without supporting authority. The contrast was striking. Late in the afternoon, Travis uncovered one final detail while reviewing meeting schedules. Willow Creek Estates was holding an open board meeting the following week. Residents could attend. Questions could be asked. Public comments could be made. The room grew quiet. Everyone understood the significance immediately. For weeks we had been gathering records from archives, homeowners, and county offices. Now there would be an opportunity to place the evidence directly in front of the board. The thought lingered over the table as shadows stretched across the pasture. The goal was no longer finding information. The goal was presenting it. Before everyone left, I packed the most important documents into a single binder. Maps, emails, meeting notes, county records, the rejected proposal. Everything fit together now. As the last truck disappeared down the ranch road, I looked at the binder resting on the kitchen table. One question sat at the center of it all. I planned to ask it publicly. The board meeting room was already crowded when I arrived. Pickup trucks filled the parking lot outside the Willow Creek Estates clubhouse. The evening air carried the smell of fresh-cut grass and warm pavement. Through the windows, I could see rows of chairs packed with residents. Some recognized me immediately. Others recognized the binder tucked beneath my arm. Word had spread faster than I expected. Travis arrived a few minutes later. Owen followed behind him. Linda was already inside, speaking quietly with several homeowners. The atmosphere felt different from any meeting I had attended before. People were not gathering because of landscaping projects or budget updates. They were waiting for answers. I stepped into the room and heard conversations stop momentarily. Then they resumed in lower voices. Diane sat at the front beside the other board members. She looked composed, professional, prepared, yet something had changed. For the first time, she no longer controlled all the information in the room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The smell of coffee drifted from a table near the entrance. Residents filled every available chair. Some stood against the walls. The meeting began with routine business. Financial updates, maintenance reports, committee announcements. Ordinary topics delivered in ordinary voices. Yet everyone seemed to be waiting for the same moment. Eventually, public comments opened. The room became noticeably quieter. Diane asked if anyone wished to speak. I stood. The sound of my chair moving echoed across the room. Several residents turned immediately. I carried the binder to the front table and placed it carefully on the surface. The thick stack of records landed with a dull thud. Nobody interrupted. Nobody needed to. The binder spoke for itself. I introduced myself and identified my ranch location. Then I asked a simple question. What recorded document gives the HOA authority over my property? Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Focused silence. Diane adjusted several papers in front of her. Then she explained that the association had long-standing community interests extending beyond subdivision boundaries. Her answer sounded polished, familiar. It also avoided the question. I asked again, this time more specifically, what recorded document grants authority over my parcel? The room remained still. A mini hook settled over the audience. Everyone understood exactly what was being asked. Diane referenced neighborhood standards. I asked for the document. She referenced shared concerns. I asked for the document. She referenced community expectations. I asked for the document. The pattern became impossible to miss. Then I opened the binder. One by one, I placed copies on the table. County parcel maps, historical newsletters, board correspondence, the rejected expansion proposal, the leadership summary describing jurisdiction limits. Residents leaned forward in their seats. Board members exchanged glances. Several papers moved from hand to hand across the table. I was careful not to argue. Facts rarely benefit from shouting. I simply walked through the timeline. Older records respecting boundaries. Later communications blurring them. Failed efforts to expand influence. Notices appearing afterward. The progression spoke for itself. Then Linda stood and addressed the room. She explained where the records came from. Storage boxes, archived materials, homeowner packets, internal publications. Nothing had been obtained secretly. These were documents residents already possessed. That detail mattered. Trust in the evidence grew visibly. Another homeowner stood. Then another. Questions started coming from inside the subdivision itself. Not hostile questions. Practical ones. Residents wanted clarity. They wanted to know where authority began and where it ended. The board reviewed documents for nearly 30 minutes. Page after page crossed the table. The atmosphere shifted slowly but unmistakably. The conversation was no longer about unpaid dues. It was about proof. Every path led back to the same issue. Eventually, one board member cleared his throat and asked Diane directly whether a recorded document existed. The room became completely silent. Even the air conditioner seemed louder. Diane looked down at the papers spread before her. Then she reached for a folder we had not seen before. The folder looked thinner than I expected. Diane opened it carefully and placed several pages on the table. Every eye in the room followed the movement. The fluorescent lights reflected off the paper. The air conditioner hummed overhead. Nobody spoke. For weeks, everything had been moving toward this moment. The question was simple. Did a recorded document exist or not? Diane slid the first page toward the other board members. They reviewed it silently. Then another page followed. Then another. I watched their expressions change. Not dramatically, just enough. Small pauses, slight frowns, longer looks at specific paragraphs. Those reactions told me more than words. A mini hook settled over the room. Whatever sat inside that folder was not ending the discussion. It was complicating it. One board member adjusted his glasses and asked where the documents originated. Diane explained they were internal policy materials used to guide community interactions with neighboring properties. The distinction immediately mattered. Policy materials are not recorded property instruments. They are not deeds. They are not plats. They are not legal descriptions. Several residents seemed to realize the same thing at the exact same moment. A quiet murmur spread through the room. The board member asked again, "Did any document inside the folder establish jurisdiction over specific outside parcels?" Diane hesitated. Then she answered, "No." The room became completely silent. The answer hung there longer than anyone expected. Not because it was surprising, because it confirmed what the evidence had been suggesting for weeks. The board members continued reviewing papers. One of them opened the binder I brought and compared documents side by side. County maps, meeting summaries, internal correspondence, historical newsletters. The comparison took several minutes. Nobody interrupted. Nobody rushed the process. Facts were finally being examined in the same place at the same time. Then another homeowner stood up, a resident from inside Willow Creek Estates. He explained that he voted against the expansion proposal years earlier. He remembered the discussion clearly. His recollection matched the records Linda found. Soon another resident spoke. Then another. Memories that once existed separately started aligning with the documentation on the table. The picture became increasingly clear. The association had explored broader influence. Homeowners rejected it. Yet the idea never completely disappeared. It simply changed form. The room felt different now. Earlier, people came expecting conflict. Now they were watching clarification unfold. That shift mattered. One board member finally addressed the audience directly. He acknowledged that no recorded authority over neighboring ranches had been presented during the meeting. Several residents nodded. Others looked relieved. A few appeared frustrated. Not because the evidence was unclear, because they had assumed the authority existed for years. Assumptions can be powerful things, especially when repeated often enough. Diane remained composed. To her credit, she did not argue with the records. She did not challenge the maps. She did not dispute the rejected proposal. Instead, she explained that her intention was preserving neighborhood standards and protecting property values. Some residents accepted that explanation. Others focused on the practical issue. Intentions and authority are not the same thing. Outside, darkness settled across the parking lot. Through the clubhouse windows, I could see streetlights reflecting off-parked vehicles. The meeting had lasted far longer than scheduled. Yet nobody seemed eager to leave. There was still one final issue. What happened next? The board discussed the matter quietly among themselves. Notes were exchanged. Documents reviewed again. Then the board president, who had remained largely silent throughout the evening, spoke for the first time. He proposed an independent review of all notices, assessments, and enforcement actions involving properties outside subdivision boundaries. The suggestion immediately changed the atmosphere. Residents leaned forward. Ranch owners exchanged looks. The proposal received support almost instantly. More importantly, nobody offered a recorded document proving otherwise. Weeks of questions had finally reached the same destination. The evidence stood alone now. As the meeting drew toward its conclusion, the board president requested one additional item before any final decisions were announced. The board president waited until the room settled completely before speaking again. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. Papers remained scattered across the long table. Outside, the parking lot sat under a blanket of warm Texas darkness. Everyone seemed to understand that the next few minutes mattered. He requested that the association attorney review every notice, assessment demand, compliance letter, and enforcement action directed toward properties outside the recorded subdivision boundaries. Then he requested something even more important. He asked whether any recorded instrument existed granting authority over the ranches represented in the room. The attorney reviewed several documents quietly. Pages turned. Notes were checked. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. Finally, he gave a simple answer. No such recorded instrument had been presented. No one challenged the statement. No one produced a missing document. No one opened a drawer and revealed evidence that changed the story. The answer stood alone. A mini hook lingered for a moment. Weeks of pressure had led to a conclusion that fit on a single line. The board president nodded slowly. Then he announced that all pending actions involving outside ranch properties would be suspended pending review. The room released a collective breath. Not cheering, not celebration. Relief. Residents exchanged looks. Ranch owners sat back in their chairs. The tension that had filled the clubhouse for weeks finally began to loosen. Diane remained professional throughout the discussion. She acknowledged the review process and agreed to cooperate with the board's request. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes. Administrative details were discussed. Follow-up. Procedures were outlined. Homeowners asked questions. Most of the questions centered on clarity. People wanted boundaries defined. They wanted records reviewed. They wanted confidence that future decisions would be based on documented authority rather than assumptions. By the time the meeting adjourned, the atmosphere felt completely different from when it began. Groups formed throughout the room. Conversations replaced arguments. Questions replaced accusations. Facts had changed the tone of the entire discussion. Outside, the night air felt cooler. Crickets chirped near the clubhouse landscaping. Travis stepped beside me as we walked toward the parking lot. Neither of us spoke immediately. There was not much left to say. The documents had done the talking. Over the following weeks, the review moved forward. Notices directed at the ranch owners were withdrawn. Assessment demands disappeared. Compliance letters stopped arriving. More importantly, the board distributed clarification materials to residents explaining where association authority began and where it ended. The boundaries shown in county records matched the boundaries described by the association once again. The confusion gradually faded. One afternoon, nearly 2 months later, I stood beside the fence line watching cattle move across the pasture. The wind carried the familiar smell of dry grass and sun-warmed earth. The ranch looked exactly as it had before the first notice arrived. Yet something had changed. Not the land, the understanding surrounding it. A truck approached along the county road and slowed near the gate. It was Linda. She stepped out carrying a small box. Inside were copies of the documents that helped untangle the entire situation. Historical maps, meeting summaries, newsletters, records that almost remained forgotten in storage. We laughed about how ordinary pieces of paper ended up solving a dispute that months of assumptions could not. Before leaving, she looked across the ranch and smiled. The view had never belonged to the HOA. It never needed permission to exist. After she drove away, I stood alone near the gate for a few minutes. The sun drifted lower across the horizon. Long shadows stretched across the pasture. The same land remained where it had always been. The same boundaries remained where they had always been. The difference was that everyone could finally see them clearly. Justice was not loud. It arrived one document at a time.